So I'm here to talk to you today about building a world-class early careers strategy, which I've just realised sounds really massive, like I've got all the answers, which I definitely haven't. But what I would say is, despite my long career in early careers, no one's ever sat me down and said, Jen, do you know how to build an early careers strategy? Let me show you exactly how you would do that. Where would you start? How would you go about that? No one's ever done that. So I don't know if you've had that in your career or in your roles, but I'm going to attempt today to talk to you about some hints and tips on how it might work. And I'll just kick off by asking, how many of you, if you could raise your hands, think you've already got a world-class early careers strategy in place? One. Congratulations. I feel really pleased for you. Look, I'll be honest with all of you that didn't put your hand up. Neither do I. We do not have a world-class early careers strategy at this present time, but we're getting one and we're building towards it and we're making progress every single year. And I think, my boss always says to me, we measure the gains, not the gaps. So I think that's something you should bear in mind when you're thinking about your own early careers strategy. So let's get stuck in. So I love this pig. This is what I thought of when I first started thinking about an early careers strategy. So why is it so hard? It sounds so simple, right? Just build your strategy, get the plan in place, off you go. But it's not that easy. And I don't know about you, but every firm I've worked for, and I've worked in lots of different sectors, they all seem to know how to do early careers better than me and better than my team, which is incredible. But I'm being a bit silly there. We love the stakeholder engagement. We love everybody getting involved. But ultimately, there can be too many cooks in the kitchen. And I don't know about you, but I sometimes feel like I've been pulled in 10 different directions. And you're trying to get through that noise and really figure out, okay, how do we get a strategy together? You also might find you've got some competing priorities. So I think, Lauren talked about some of them earlier, and Camilla as well. So maybe you're trying to have a diverse talent pool, but you're also looking for really niche skills, and those two don't work together very well. Or maybe you're trying to have a really high-touch attraction strategy, but actually you're trying to save money and do things really efficiently. So you've got this constant jostling of, which path do I take? How do I come up with a clear strategy? We've talked loads about ROI today. I hate those little letters. Sometimes they come back to bite you. But early careers, for me, it is a strategic priority. And if we can get it right, we can actually gain competitive advantage for our companies through early careers. So how do we prove that ROI? And we have touched on that earlier today. And again, I don't know about you, but I've mentioned operational overload. Early careers is flipping difficult. It's very operationally complex, whether you're hiring thousands of early careers hires or just a few. It's a big operation. There's lots of facets. So that can get in the way of having that strategic mindset and really raising our game as early careers professionals. And I mentioned that business engagement. Look, where I work at Kainos, the CEO gets involved. He's in it. He loves early careers. In fact, he was a grad himself and he's been there ever since. So you can only imagine the sort of pressure and engagement, which is a really good thing. But, sometimes we need to balance that with our own expertise. So that's why I think it's hard. But let's then think about, where do you start? So if you're sitting there thinking, look, I've got a really evolved early careers strategy, it's quite sophisticated, or you're at the opposite end thinking, I'm not even sure I've got a strategy. And hopefully we can talk together a little bit now about how we could begin to build it. So for me, start at the end. And that might sound really counterintuitive, but I think it's something a few of the other speakers said earlier. So what are the outcomes that you are trying to get to? And those outcomes might be this year, 2 years' time, 3 years' time. But what are you actually trying to do? And I think it was Lauren actually who was mentioning about business objectives. So are you trying to have a tech-enabled process? Are you trying to be in the top 50 of the Times Top 100? Are you trying to build a more diverse talent pool? What are you doing? Why are you here? And I think, as has already been said, if you link it to real business problems, you're onto a winner. It's a great place to start. Now, I am no consultant. I will not claim to be one ever. But when I'm building my early careers strategy or evolving it, I try to think like a consultant. So what do consultants do? They walk into organizations, they bring that external perspective, and they really get to the root of the issue. They do a deep dive, they dig really deep. So by thinking like a consultant and really being quite objective about your organization, your early careers offering, almost asking yourself those difficult questions that you might be avoiding, you can really start to properly analyze your proposition. And what I even do with my team, and I do it most years actually, is conduct what I would call a discovery. So a bit of a diagnostic on your own early careers proposition. So I literally write out a list of questions that I would ask if I was an external consultant coming into Kainos or whatever company you work for, to really understand what your offering is, what it stands for, why does it exist, what problems are you trying to solve? And you're just forcing yourself to think objectively. You're not getting tangled up in all of that operational detail that we spoke about, but it can really help you to understand where you are today. And then that leads on to giving you a really good analysis of the current state. So don't just focus on the bad stuff and the problems. Yes, of course, we should do that. But where are your strengths? Where are your USPs? Where are you better than everybody else, or definitely up there? Because those are the bits of your strategy that you want to keep every year and keep pushing and fighting for, because that's where you're going to excel. Then, of course, you've got your future state, which are your dreams, your ambitions, where you'd really like to be. And I would say in that part of your analysis, don't hold back. Just be bold. Put down whatever you think's right. You can always pare it back a little bit later. You can always manage the messaging when you speak to the business. But at this stage, you're brainstorming. You're letting yourself look at the gaps between your current state and where you'd really like to be. And look, when you're thinking about being a consultant, conduct some surveys, interview your stakeholders, interview your team, gather that feedback, ask everybody the same simple 5 questions. Pop them into ChatGPT, it'll come up with loads of ideas. You can do that to really dig deep and do that analysis. I would also encourage you, I'm sure you do this already, but have a look at that external market as well. Talk to your peers, just like the brilliant people in the room that are around you. What are they doing? What are they struggling with? And also there's loads of data sources now where you can look at the external market, which can really help you understand your own position. I've said be honest because, look, we need to sometimes sugarcoat things. It's been tough in early careers for the last few years, but do try and be brutally honest. It's just for you and your team to start with, so you get to really dig deep. And I've said here as well to try and stay curious. I don't know how you approach work, but I am a bit of a problem solver. So give me a problem, I'm straight into the solution. But really try and hold off from making assumptions or deciding what the outcome's going to be or exactly what's going to be in your strategy until you've completed that analysis, because then you won't jump to conclusions. You might be a bit innovative, and then hopefully it will be even more closely aligned with those business priorities that we've spoken about. Then I've talked about, right, you've done your deep dive now, you've got loads of data, whatever data you have available, and I think we all know it can be quite mixed for us in early careers. You've got all that information, what do you do with it? I would recommend that you create a series of problem statements. So again, I think this was said earlier actually, what are the actual problems you are trying to solve through early careers? Is it because you want to build your future leaders? Is it because you want a more diverse talent pool through the organisation? Are you perhaps trying to build skills that don't exist today, but you're going to need them tomorrow? But you absolutely need to know this, and you need to know what your problems are. And maybe it's a case of that you've got too many applications. That's probably something we suffer with, to be honest. The volume's high, but the quality's mixed. Maybe that's your problem statement. And once you've got those down, you can really start to prioritise what should be in your strategy, either for the year ahead or beyond that. And I've mentioned here, to help you prioritise, try and challenge yourself to think, well, what happens if I do nothing? I love using that with business stakeholders, because if you tell them the impact of doing absolutely nothing, they're scared. You're creating a bit of fear, you're creating a bit of a burning platform and urgency. So if you really understand what the impact of doing absolutely nothing is in those particular areas, and with that problem statement, it suddenly gets a bit of a laser focus on that particular problem. And what I tend to do as well when I've got a whole list of problem statements, and look, you might have 5, you might have 50, you're not going to be able to do them all. So I then try and challenge myself to say, right, I'm going to give these a rating in terms of how difficult they are to implement. And I might rate them 1 to 5, for an example, 1 being super easy, 5 being super difficult. And then I might also rate them in terms of impact, 1 to 5. So if you've got something that's high impact, it's going to make a real difference to your company or your business or your candidates, for example, but it's also a really high difficulty rating. It might not be one for this year. It might be one for 2 years' time or 3 years' time. But if you've got something that's high impact but low difficulty level, get it done now. That's a quick win. That's in your strategy, and that's something that you can focus on. So that's what I tend to do just when you've got those problem statements. It really then helps you to prioritize your thinking. So you've got your problem statements now, you're beginning to actually build your strategy, you're starting to go into your solutions mode, starting to get some ideas down on paper which you can talk to your business about. And I don't know if you like this word, it's a little cheesy, but I've referred to guiding principles here. Now, they are just words on a page unless you make them otherwise. So it's up to you to figure out what are your guiding principles for you, for your team, for early careers in general. And I've put some words on the page here that I've used previously in my team. And to get to these words, I wouldn't just make them up. Again, I'd talk to stakeholders, I'd talk to my team, I'd do a bit of research. And the reason I have these is because it really can help you with decision making. So when you're trying to figure out for that strategy what to put in there, if it doesn't align with these guiding principles that you've created, it's gone, it's out, forget it, you're not doing it. So when you're being pushed and pulled around, perhaps by different business stakeholders, or you might be pressurized by the market because someone down the road's doing it, if it doesn't align with your guiding principles, it's a no, because you've already gone through these really carefully, you've decided what's important, and if it's not one of these, it's not happening. So it can be a really helpful decision-making tool when you're building your strategy. But you'll need to find the words that have the most meaning for you and that are the most relevant for you. Then we move on to digging a little bit deeper, and I've called this, I think this is quite cheesy as well, I think I need to have a look at my slide creation, but I've called this the moments that matter. And I just wanted to show you some examples of what I think are the moments that matter within early careers. Now, a lot of people today, I've been really pleased actually to hear people say, early careers is complex. There's so many facets to it. There's a million things you could do. There's a million decisions you could make. But imagine if you tried to do all of this every year, all in one go. It would be a nightmare. You'd leave your company. You'd never work in early careers again. And you certainly wouldn't have a solid, clear strategy that you can articulate to your business. So I've given some examples here of the kind of things that I think are moments that might matter. They'll be different for all of your companies. Only you know your company and the moments that matter for you. But you might end up thinking, right, well, a moment that really matters this year is the reward package. We keep getting declined because we are not competitive on salary. So I'm going to need to work really closely with our business and our reward team. That is a moment that matters, because if I don't have that as part of my strategy to improve our reward capability, we're not going to be able to compete, and that's that. And of course, it's not so simple as that. You then need a business case. But if you've recognized that as a moment that matters, it really should be in your strategy. I've used this slide as well, or a version of it, with stakeholders to try and to get them to understand that full early careers life cycle. It's not just one element of this, of course. There's many different elements to early careers. And in your companies, you may have one team delivering all of this, or in my team, this is sort of spread across multiple areas. It doesn't matter. You're trying to educate your business, upskill them, and again, just demonstrate to them that you're thinking more strategically. You're stepping out of the operational bit for a second, and you're really thinking about the moments that will matter and again will deliver the most return. So I couldn't get towards the end of the talk today without talking a bit more about what I've called champions, but you may call them stakeholders or colleagues or business reps or any of the above. But we all have a lot of stakeholders in early careers. I don't know how many you have. I don't know if you've ever counted. Maybe you should. But me and my team had a look at this last year, and we realised across all of our early careers efforts, my team was spending 140 hours a month, including my time, on stakeholder stuff. Whether it was engaging them, briefing them, seeking approval, presenting the strategy, presenting the business case. And often what was happening is we were all having similar kind of meetings, but we weren't joined up. We just weren't connected. So I think giving some time and thought to how you engage with your stakeholders is a massive part of building any strategy. And I'd absolutely encourage you, I'm sure you do it anyway, to really develop that consultative relationship with your stakeholders. So we're not exactly going to tell them what to do, and they shouldn't just be telling us what to do, but it's gaining that mutual respect and having those conversations and really having that partnership. And obviously it takes a bit of time to build, and some stakeholders are way more willing and cooperative than others. But really giving it some thought about how you want to engage with them and when you want to engage with them, I've found that to be really, really effective. So just some suggestions for you to take on board and to consider, really. So I would always suggest carving out a bit of time to build a stakeholder map, which I've just realised sounds like the most boring words I've probably ever said, so I apologise for that. You can basically Google stakeholder maps and you can find some really simple stuff online. But even if you've worked at your company for 5 years, 10 years, and if you haven't done this, I definitely encourage you to give it a whirl. I tend to create a really simple grid, and I've sat down and done this with my team. And I think about, on one axis I might have engagement in terms of the stakeholder, and on the other one I might have something like influence. So if you're I haven't done a diagram, I really should actually, but if you visualize that matrix, if you've got someone in the top right of that matrix, you've got someone who's highly engaged and highly influential. And I would count someone like my CEO as that. And it's pros and cons, like I said earlier, of having a CEO so involved in early careers, but he is brilliant. But because he's so influential, obviously being the CEO, and he's super engaged, I really think carefully about when I meet him, how can I engage with him? What do I need him for? What does he need me for? And what information do I share with him and when? And I've gone through this exercise with all our key stakeholders. So it really quickly gives you a good idea of how much time you're spending with your stakeholders. And do you have enough of them in the right boxes? Imagine if everyone in your matrix is low levels of engagement and low levels of influence. What's the point? Why are we engaging with them? I'm not trying to offend any stakeholders here, but it's a more strategic approach to working with your stakeholders rather than just thinking, must email them, must update them, must go and see them. If you just pause and think, how do they fit into the strategy? How can they really support the strategy that I'm evolving? The map really helps, and you can get your team to participate in that as well. I've talked about assigning roles, but all I mean by that is, do you have the right people in the right roles to drive your strategy forward? So you might not have the CEO on board, and maybe you don't need them. Maybe that's absolutely not the case. In previous companies, I haven't had a close relationship with the CEO like I do now. But do you have enough people to help you make decisions, to sign off on business cases, to support your ideas? I think Becky was saying about she has some really wild out there ideas. So who is your champion? Have you got someone in your stakeholder group that can take those ideas on, that can bounce them around and help you translate them into something manageable and doable? And if you haven't, find them. So by assigning roles, you don't need to officially give them a role. They may not know what their role is. But from your perspective in your strategy, you are figuring out, have I got the right people in the right roles? And then lastly, on the stakeholder piece, I've mentioned having a communication plan. Sounds like a lot of work. I promise it needn't be. But even if you've got the best strategy in the world, if you haven't thought about how you're going to communicate it, roll it out, get people excited, it probably will either fail or just disappear into insignificance. And if you put loads of work into it, that's not what you want to happen. And remember, if you are using your strategy to solve real business problems, which we all want to and we should be in early careers, you don't want that to go to waste. So when I'm thinking about the season ahead, again, once you've got that map, you understand who your stakeholders are and where the gaps are, you can then think about how do you communicate with them. So who just needs to be informed versus who needs to be consulted, versus who is a decision maker and who isn't. And I almost start to think at what stages in the cycle and at what months, what timings would I engage with them. So it's a simple, again, you could just create a really simple grid, but once you've got those problem statements down and you want to start discussing them to build your strategy, without your stakeholders, it's a bit of a lost cause. So I definitely encourage you to give that some thought and be really strategic and just demonstrate that as early careers professionals, we can meet our stakeholders where they are. You know, we can absolutely meet them on that strategic level, talk their language, and make sure that what we're doing is very targeted to their needs as well as our own. We've talked about this a lot today, so I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but measuring the impact can be really hard. And look, like I said, I haven't got all this figured out. We have mixed data in the company I work for now. I don't have lots of fancy dashboards and data at my fingertips. But I think going back to what people have said earlier, do you have some measures in place? Even if you've got 2 or 3, before you start hiring again for the next season, decide on 2 or 3 or 4 things that will help you measure the success of your strategy. So our CFO always says to me, how will I know when it's done? When he looks at the early career strategy, when will this be done? How will I know? And if you challenge yourself to answer that question, that usually gives you the KPI, that usually gives you the key performance indicator, because if you'll have done X by completing Y, you'll know that that's been achieved. So if you're struggling to think, how do I measure that? There is always a measure. It's just some of them might be a bit more anecdotal, some might be numerical, but as long as you're able to demonstrate that progress year on year or month on month, whatever you're measuring, that's good. That's about measuring, again, the gains, not the gaps. Feedback we've talked about loads as well, but I would definitely encourage you to use feedback to measure your strategy. You know, once you've got all of those things in place, you've communicated that beautiful plan, everyone's on board, it is about getting feedback, whether it's from your hires themselves, again, stakeholders, your team, maybe even externally, to validate if you have made progress. And look, if you haven't ticked all the boxes, don't be disappointed. A strategy should be challenging, it should be forward-looking, it should be stretching you. So don't be disappointed if you haven't achieved absolutely everything. And the last thing I'll say is retros, or maybe you call them wash-ups or end-of-season reviews. For me, this is non-negotiable. Again, it goes back to my point of starting at the end. So my team are just in the process now of conducting retros on the hiring season that's just been, certainly for our graduates. And we've developed a bit of a formula for this now, where again, we challenge our thinking, we go back to those data points that we set at the start of the hiring season, and we see how we've done. And look, some of them we're calculating manually. We're sat there with an Excel spreadsheet. Our ATS doesn't necessarily give us what we want. But we just have maybe 5 to 7 simple measures that we set as part of our strategy at the beginning of the year, and now we're revisiting. And if it hasn't worked, we can review why, and if it has, we can do more of it. So I think measure, measure, measure would be my advice, but it doesn't have to be something big, expansive and fancy and complicated. You could just have 3 core measures that you can discuss with your business, get them on board, and then measure them at the end of the hiring season. So just to wrap up then, here are my, top tips in terms of things to consider when you're building that strategy ready to communicate. And my 3 takeaways from today would be, firstly, carve out some headspace for yourself to do this. It's so hard to get away from the operational grind, but do it. Get on Do Not Disturb, put your out of office on, whatever you need to do, but engage your team in that discovery. Build those problem statements, give yourself the time to really do that deep dive and that analysis. Then I would say number 2 is don't boil the ocean, i.e. if you think about that moments that matter slide, you can't do it all. Don't try and do it all. And if that difficulty rating outweighs the impact, maybe it's not one for this year, maybe it's for the future. And thirdly, I would say just become an expert in communicating your strategy. Get some little sound bites, get those data points, find that language that really explains your strategy and why you're doing it. And you'll see that your organisation soon starts using that language back to you because you've influenced their way of thinking. So do that consistently. And that is it. So just thank you so much for listening. Thanks so much for your time, and I really hope you've taken something away. Thank you.